This girl reveals shocking crime in Millionaire's mansion. When everyone discovers the truth behind this crime, everyone is shocked. Comment giving a rating from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The scream sliced through the muggy afternoon air like a blade, echoing through the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. The widowed millionaire, 52 years old, nearly knocked over his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the 2-story colonial house across the street, a faded yellow building with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. His fortune, accumulated through investments in Wall Street stocks, had afforded him one of the best addresses in the area, but even all his wealth couldn't buy the peace he so desperately sought. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but preferred to stay away from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone, since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the colonial house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, too young to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the alcohol, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap bourbon she had been drinking since noon at the corner bar, O'Malley's. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that the screams only enraged her aunt, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember the soft voice of her mother, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. "Stop whining," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon away in the cabinet as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get that charcoal all over the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum softly her mother's song, the only thing that still consoled her. She didn't know that across the street someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His late wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His net worth seemed endless, but what good was all that wealth if he couldn't even have a peaceful afternoon? Next door to the colonial house, the retired 61-year-old teacher watered her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the millionaire, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, watching the windows of the house. The family that lived there she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had talked properly to the aunt, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before his wife's accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains that surrounded the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her little fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries, and the typical movement of the historic town, awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The aunt hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I'd really like to meet your niece. I heard she's an adorable girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a yellow smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Better not get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the visitor. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold." "It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even so early in the day. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams, where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity invaded him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not without casting an investigative look inside the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the colonial house, the aunt locked the door firmly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the 4-year-old girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The woman laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to sing softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the ears of the businessman again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while she worked. She was an exemplary woman until she disappeared abruptly. She always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named "It's her," the millionaire muttered, his cell phone trembling in his hands. The daughter of his ex-employee was named exactly as he suspected. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? His net worth was in the millions, but all that wealth hadn't given him enough wisdom to see the obvious. The businessman put his cell phone away and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, that woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock punctually, the screams started again. This time the millionaire didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the colonial house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time, the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. His investments in stocks had given him financial security, but no amount of money in the world could erase what he was witnessing. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His financial holdings and investment funds could solve many problems, but this one required more than money. It required courage to act. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the millionaire couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. All his fortune built over the years seemed insignificant in the face of the responsibility that now weighed on his shoulders. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few yards from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. What she saw horrified her. The 4-year-old girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the old woman watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all older women. "Hi, sweetheart," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The child glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's pretty. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the girl, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress, took a tray with homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the colonial house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly irritated with the neighbor's insistence. "Teacher, I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday. interrupted the educator firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame. Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything." "Anything at all?" The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the visitor left, the aunt locked the door firmly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The woman took the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to call attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions. You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His profits and dividends could make a difference in that girl's life, but first he needed to act. While the child suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, Bob. "I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it could be a matter of life." The lawyer listened attentively as the businessman recounted everything he had discovered and documented. The videos, the recordings, the connection with his former employee, everything. "This is very serious," said the lawyer after analyzing some evidence sent by text message. "If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the millionaire, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. She worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to sneak out silently to the yard. Her newborns burned, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming softly her mother's song. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. and that, in the next few days, her life would change in ways that she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, the millionaire watched the small silhouette in the yard, his heart heavy with the weight of decisions that he could no longer postpone. His income and wealth had given him power, but now he needed to use that power to protect an innocent child. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues in college almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call from the previous night had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said the lawyer, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The millionaire poured coffee and stood near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the millionaire, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously. But sometimes at other times too," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the night. "How many times do I need to tell you not to get the walls dirty?" shouted the woman, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hall. "And if I hear a single noise, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to the center of town, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was reviewing. "Professor Miller, good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The employee straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a child protective services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Professor Miller was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said the counselor, picking up a complaint form. While the educator reported her observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on the lawyer's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked the lawyer, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." Thus it was that by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The counselor was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, this is Counselor Johnson speaking." "This is District Attorney Thompson. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Main Street. We have evidence of severe child abuse." The employee paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow colonial house?" "Exactly." "How did you know?" "I just received a report about the same house," replied Counselor Johnson, looking at Professor Miller with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the gravity of the situation." By 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The counselor, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the colonial house. Professor Miller had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the child's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Bob, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the colonial house. When Counselor Johnson knocked on the door of the colonial house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Professor Miller who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts. The child raised her big, scared eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetheart," said Counselor Johnson, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We're here to help you." The girl looked at Professor Miller, recognizing the kind old woman who had talked to her in the yard. A flicker of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt is going to be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said Professor Miller, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" 6 months later, the now 5-year-old girl was playing in the yard of a loving foster family, her arms finally free of scars, her smile slowly returning. The businessman had used part of his fortune to ensure that she had the best medical and psychological care, establishing an investment fund that would secure her future. The aunt had been prosecuted and convicted, but more important than the punishment was knowing that she could never hurt a child again. Professor Miller visited the girl regularly, seeing her blossom in an environment of love and care. And every afternoon, when the sun set over the mountains, the child still sang her mother's song. But now it was no longer a lament of pain, but a celebration of the life that had been returned to her. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.